So after spending a great deal of time and attention looking at the New England colonies and the Chesapeake colonies, let's shift gears to talk about the remaining colonies that we have yet to discuss, which are the Restoration colonies. And the Restoration is a moment in British history. After the English Civil War, the monarch, Charles I, was actually executed after a long power struggle with Parliament. And after a period of about 2 decades, when Parliament is actually under the control of Oliver Cromwell and it's considered the Commonwealth of England or a republic. In around 1660, the monarchy will be restored when Charles II, the son of the executed monarch, will be restored to power. The monarchy will be restored to power, and England will begin to establish some new colonies in the New World that will certainly help to strengthen its possession of the Atlantic coast and certainly grow, its economic prowess beyond what has already been established by both New England and the Chesapeake. So let's explore the multiple colonies that are established during this Restoration era. So, some questions to consider then, much like we did for New England and the Chesapeake. So as we look at the Restoration colonies, who settles them and for what reason? What's the economy like? What's the role of religion in these colonies? What's the social structure of these colonies? The political structure? And relationships with Native American tribes. So keep these questions in mind going forward. So let's start with our own home state of New York, which was not New York initially. So if you take a look at this map, one big problem that the English have, the English government, and throughout the period of the 1630s and 40s and 50s, England is in political turmoil given the power struggle between Parliament and the King, which will eventually lead to the English Civil War. And because of this struggle, we're not going to say the colonies are neglected, but certainly, right, there's not a lot of authority being imposed on them from England because England is distracted by its own issues. Well, it's in this kind of gap then that you see the Dutch actually step in to the New World and establish a colony right smack in the middle between the New England settlements and the Chesapeake settlements. Now, geopolitically speaking, in terms of military strategy and economic strategy, this is a big problem for the English because to link Massachusetts and New England in terms of trade, that now means that they're going to have to sail beyond Dutch colonies. And this is the 1600s. This is the golden age of Dutch civilization. The Dutch have an incredibly powerful navy. They have an incredibly strong empire, not necessarily in the New World, but worldwide. So the Dutch have made great strides in Asia in establishing colonies and access to very precious resources that make their empire incredibly wealthy. So, New Netherland. New Netherland is what New York used to be. So Netherlands and Dutch can be used interchangeably. We're referring to the same place, but just kind of repeating what we just said on the last slide. So this is the golden age of Dutch history. They have an incredibly powerful navy. They've challenged England on the high seas. Remember, the English navy is growing in strength throughout the 1600s, and by the 1700s it'll be the strongest in the world, but it's certainly not there yet. So most of the Dutch wealth for their empire is coming from the East Indies, and they're getting rich off of trade, not necessarily getting rich off of establishing large settlements or large colonies. The Dutch pretty much have an empire based on trade. One man who's very important in establishing the Dutch presence around the world is Henry Hudson. Now, Henry Hudson is actually an Englishman who went on a series of explorations for the Dutch East India Company. Now, this is a private company. Some people say one of the first multinational corporations that ever existed. And it's very similar to the Virginia Company. So you have private investors who are coming together, sponsoring these explorations for the purposes of economic gain. Well, Hudson discovers a variety of things in the New World. So one of his first voyages, he discovers New York Harbor and the Hudson River. At first, he thinks the Hudson River is a potential Northwest Passage, which is what he's looking for, right? The Dutch are looking for a shortcut to the East Indies to try to cut down the travel time between the Netherlands and those colonies that they have there. On subsequent voyages, when he realizes the Hudson River does not go any further than Albany, he sails up through Canada. He'll discover Hudson Bay, but eventually we'll realize that is not the Northwest Passage. But it is Henry Hudson who helps to discover this land, and his voyages will serve as the impetus then for the Dutch setting up a colony in what was now New York. So New Netherlands then will be founded in the Hudson River area. It will also encompass obviously Manhattan, New York City. So it's established not by the Dutch East India Company, but by the Dutch West India Company. And they see obviously economic opportunity in the fur trade. Now, the company won't pay as much attention to this colony as it may other colonies. Certainly the more lucrative trades in spices and products from the East Indies will reap greater profits, so they receive a lot more of attention. And the island of Manhattan, which will become New Amsterdam, Amsterdam being obviously the capital of the Netherlands, so they label this new city that they've found in the New World New Amsterdam. And if you think about how expensive real estate is in Manhattan today, it was purchased for pennies per acre. I believe it ended up being the equivalent of about $26 the island of Manhattan was purchased for from Native American tribes. Now, given its geographical location, certainly to this day, right, New York is a huge economic powerhouse. And back then, certainly as a port city, it's a massive, massive trading depot. So New Amsterdam Harbor. So the company controls the town. It's run in the interest of the shareholders, much like the Virginia Company. And, the company doesn't have any interest in religious toleration. It doesn't have an interest in free speech or democracy. So some similarities to Jamestown and Virginia, right? So, we don't really care necessarily about these political principles. This is not going to be a city upon a hill. This is just for economic motives. The governors who are appointed by the company were rather autocratic. So actually very different from life in the Netherlands, which we'll talk about in subsequent slides. Religious dissenters were persecuted, including the Quakers, who are going to come in later in this lecture. And they had a local assembly, but it has only limited power to make laws. And this local assembly only came into existence after repeated protests by the colonists of that area. So certainly the Dutch in New Amsterdam, because it's controlled by this private corporation, the Dutch West India Company, certainly not a reflection necessarily of Dutch political principles and the toleration that pretty much drives their society during the golden age of Dutch history. Now, New Amsterdam and then also New Netherland, the way that land is going to be divided up, the Dutch are going to create a system called the patroonships. And a patroon is pretty much a lord on a feudal manor. So certain wealthy individuals are given massive tracts of land, and they're expected to settle 50 people on them who will pretty much be, much like servants or serfs. They're going to work the land. They're pretty much going to be tenants on the land. Now, as a reflection, certainly, of Dutch society, New Amsterdam, being a port city, being Dutch, it's going to be incredibly diverse. So you're going to see Jews, you're going to see Frenchmen, you're going to see people from Brazil, you're going to see Spaniards. So New York City, right from the beginning, was as diverse, certainly, as it is today. So rather interesting point. So this idea of patroonships, you can see how it extends not just in New Amsterdam, but also into New Netherlands in general. So these massive tracts of land, all bordering or crossing the Hudson River, are given to wealthy individuals. And when the English eventually take over New Netherlands, they will maintain this system, but instead of calling them patroonships, they will call them manors. So land ownership certainly is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. And well up until the Revolution, well up actually into the 19th century, in America, once independence is declared and New York is an independent state in the United States, you're going to have kind of an aristocratic landowning class in the state of New York. And by the 19th century, this will actually produce a lot of economic tension and some actual protests and riots to try to earn some protections for the people who are living in this land, who resent, obviously, the concentration of wealth and land ownership. Another colony that is established not too far from New Netherlands is actually New Sweden. And you can see where New Sweden is on the map, right near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. And what will happen to New Sweden is New Sweden will be taken over very quickly by the Dutch. So the Dutch, under their Director General, Peter Stuyvesant are going to attack New Sweden. And given the fact that the Swedes never really populate this colony in any large number, not much economic resources, not much military resources, their settlement will fall after a bloodless siege, and then the Swedes will be absorbed into New Netherland. And then how does the Dutch colony and the Dutch presence in the New World fall? Well, once the Restoration occurs and Charles II is brought back to power and the Commonwealth fails, Charles II is going to give his brother, the Duke of York, and he's going to call him in and say, why don't you go take New Netherland? And I pretty much award you this territory. And of course, this is before he can control the area. It's the Dutch colony. Well, the English are going to send a military expedition to try to attack it and take it over. Now, the English certainly have motivation for doing this. They do not want to see the Dutch potentially cut off access between New England and the Chesapeake, like we mentioned earlier. And certainly, this is a very viable colony with a very viable fur trade and a very valuable port city that the English are coveting. So in 1664, this military expedition arrives, and the Dutch are pretty much forced to surrender quite easily. It's not a bloody conflict. Very few shots no shots are fired. And once the British gain access to this colony, they rename it New York in honor, of course, of the Duke of York. So now England is strengthened its possession of its Atlantic colonies and access to trade between New England and the Chesapeake. And you can see here the Duke of York's original charter. So massive amount of territory connecting certainly a lot of different states today: Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So New Amsterdam will continue to grow, or we should say New York City will continue to grow and thrive. It will be one of the 4 major urban centers in the American colonies, the other 3 being Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And New York will be a very significant battle in the American Revolution, and also kind of a hot spot for loyalists because of the trade, the merchants, the economic connections with Great Britain. New York will be one of the last states to potentially join in the independence movement, and in fact will not vote for independence. They will abstain from independence when the vote is taken at the Continental Congress. So that economic link with England is going to be important to understand as we move into the 18th century. Now, the Dutch, so they certainly left an imprint in the New World and, in the state we live in. So here's just a few ways. If we think of, New York City, names like Harlem and Brooklyn, those are Dutch names. Architecture, you can see in this building in New York City what's called the gambrel roof. So you can see it almost looks like little steps. And then a lot of customs that certainly we adopt today: Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf. A lot of these certainly bear, Dutch culture. Even the New York City seal you can see there. You can see the Native Americans on the right and that Dutch settler on the left. So that will wrap up the New York and New Netherland and New York. Let's now turn to Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, one of the most important groups to know about in the colonial era are the Quakers. Now, who are they? The Quakers are religious dissenters in England. So certainly the Protestant Reformation has unleashed the Puritans. They're also going to unleash the Quakers, but the Quakers are going to have a unique set of beliefs. So they totally break from the Anglican Church. They are not Puritans. The Quakers is actually a pejorative. It's actually almost an insult. The true name of the church and of believers is the Society of Friends. They're called Quakers because some observers say that they quake during their intense religious practices. So they quake when they have a divine revelation that's come to them. Well, the Quakers are very controversial. They offend the religious and secular leaders in England because of their beliefs are quite anti-establishment. They claim that every person possesses the inner light. So each person has the Spirit of God within them, and God can talk to each individual. Contrast this with the Puritan idea, which says God will only speak to certain people, the elect, the visible saints. These are the people who have their fate revealed to them in the afterlife. Quakers don't buy that. Quakers don't believe in predestination either. So some radical differences with the Puritans. Because of this idea of, the Spirit of God being within them, the Quakers have a very keen sense of equality, right? If God is within everyone, everyone is equal. It's not a stratified religion. They refuse to pay taxes to support the Church of England, which of course is very stratified. They meet without paid clergy, another symbol of their egalitarianism or equality. And because they believe that every person's a child of God, they refuse to treat the upper class, the ruling class, with deference or respect. So certainly at that time period in England, in Old World Europe, there is a true belief that some people are inherently better than others, and they're born that way. The Quakers don't believe that. So the lower class people were expected in Old World Europe to defer and to show respect, to stand off to the side if you pass a wealthy individual on the street, to take off your cap and bow to them as they walk down the street. Quakers don't do that at all. They keep their hats on. They address everyone as commoners. So they say thee or thou instead of you. They would not take any oath, and certainly they're not taking oaths of loyalty to either the church or the king, believing that their only oath belongs to God. And they are nonviolent. They're pacifists. So well up till today, a lot of these are the defining characteristics of the Quaker faith and the Society of Friends. Quaker meeting houses, very plain meeting houses. So a Quaker meeting house doesn't, look like your stereotypical church that might have, certainly stained glass windows or maybe some ornate design, an altar perhaps. Quaker meeting houses could take place anywhere. And a Quaker meeting is literally people sitting roughly in a rectangle or a square and sitting in silence and pretty much just meditating and waiting for the divine Spirit of God to talk to them, to tap into their inner light. Anyone can speak. Anyone can have a revelation at any time. So it's a very, very interesting religion. Certainly very progressive. The Quakers are going to be some of the most tolerant, some of the most socially liberal people in colonial America and early America. The Quakers will actually be the first abolitionists, some of the first abolitionists. Now, how does this relate to Pennsylvania? Well, Pennsylvania gets its pen name, or its name, from William Penn. Who was William Penn? William Penn was an aristocratic Englishman who is attracted to the Quaker faith. And after serving in the military, he kind of, swears off the violence and the bloodshed and embraces pacifism. And William Penn, his father, is actually owed an $80,000 debt by King Charles II. And William Penn says, well, instead of giving me the cash, simply you can pay my debt through giving me land in the American wilderness. And so the king grants him a charter, which becomes known as Pennsylvania, or translation, Penn's Woodland. Penn sets out paid agents throughout England and advertises for his settlers. And we'll look at an account from Penn of what life is like in Pennsylvania. And as opposed to some of the pamphlets that come out of Jamestown, the pamphlets that Penn and the descriptions that Penn sets out are actually pretty accurate when you consider what life in the middle colonies in Pennsylvania is like. And they have a very liberal land policy. So, and this is going to attract immigrants from all over. So it's going to attract the French. It's going to attract a lot of Germans, English, Scots-Irish, Scots themselves. So Pennsylvania will be one of the first colonies that we can truly say is a melting pot. And land ownership is widely available. It is not like New York, not like Virginia, where land is kind of concentrated in the hands of the elite. So Pennsylvania will become kind of a haven for a lot of religious dissenters, including, of course, the Quakers. When the Quakers and settlers arrive in Pennsylvania, the relationship that they have with Native Americans is very progressive, very tolerant, very peaceful. So the settlers in Pennsylvania buy land from the Indians. They will only buy land the Indians are willing to give, and they will pay them what they perceive of as a fair price. Quakers go among the Indians unarmed. So certainly you see, a lot of tension in New England. You see a lot of tension in the Chesapeake colonies. In Pennsylvania, you do not see a war like King Philip's War. You do not see the Powhatan Massacre. You do not see the Pequot War. So you see relatively peaceful relations between the settlers and Native Americans. A problem, though, is as immigrants come to Pennsylvania, these immigrants will not share the same belief system as the Quakers. They will not share the same attitude towards Native Americans. They will not share the pacifism of the Quakers. So they will treat the Native peoples poorly, and this is going to undermine the actions of the Quakers, and there will be tension within Pennsylvania, within the government of Pennsylvania, within the legislature over, well, who's going to have, a say. So the Quakers certainly have one way of doing things, and all these immigrant groups who are jostling for political power obviously have a different perspective. Now, the government of Pennsylvania that's established, certainly with Quaker influence, very liberal for the time period, very tolerant. Representative Assembly was created and it was elected by the landowners. So you also, it's similar to the Virginia House of Burgesses. There is no tax-supported church. In Virginia, every person pays taxes to the Anglican Church. In New England, every person pays taxes to the Congregational Church. You do not see anything like that in Pennsylvania, in part because the Quakers were persecuted. They do not have a church hierarchy. They feel no need, of course, to establish an official religion. Freedom of worship is guaranteed to all. So this is the first really big instance we see of true religious freedom or toleration in the colonies. Remember, Maryland Act of Toleration might have quelled conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but in many ways was more intolerant than it was before because it meant death for Jews and Muslims. In New England, we know that they do not embrace religious toleration at all. It's a very much a community based on conformity, and dissenters are purged from those communities. However, they are forced to deny the right to vote and hold office to Catholics and Jews. And this is not necessarily a product of Quaker beliefs, but more of the English government. So they cannot receive a charter from the English king and simply disregard English law. And the death penalty is only awarded for treason and murder. And the most interesting thing about this is at the time period, there are 200 offenses that will get you executed in England. 200 capital offenses. The Quakers narrow it down to treason and murder. An incredibly pacifist, incredibly tolerant society that is established in Pennsylvania. So just to summarize before moving on, Pennsylvania society then attracts many different people, lots of religious misfits from other colonies. So people who might, be purged from New England might flock here. Many different ethnic groups because of its liberal land ownership policies and its religious toleration. There's no provision made for military defense, reflecting the Quaker pacifism. No restrictions on immigration, which of course will cause some tension, and certainly no slavery. Like we said earlier, Quakers, some of the first abolitionists. In many ways, Pennsylvania may be, and I might be being a little judgmental here, probably one of the best places to live in colonial America. So, in total then, those are the middle colonies that we've discussed then, New York and Pennsylvania. Let's move further south to talk about the Carolinas. So how are the Carolinas settled? Well, to understand the Carolinas, we have to go to the West Indies. Now, the West Indies were certainly established earlier, in the earlier 1600s. But the problem is that economic opportunity for many people is limited in the West Indies. So in 1670, what you see is a small group of English farmers comes from the West Indies to Carolina. And they realize that because of the kind of growing inequality in Barbados and other West Indies islands, sugar barons, certain people are controlling more and more land. And these are massive plantations, and they are just pumping out sugar at obviously prices that small farmers cannot compete with. Well, when these settlers go to Carolina in search of their own land and their own economic opportunity, they bring black slaves with them. So unlike Virginia, where the transition is from servitude to slavery, in the Carolinas, slavery is there from the beginning. Granted, this is the 1660s and 1670s. So the mortality rate potentially has improved. So people are not dying like they were in the Chesapeake. And they're bringing them from Barbados, where slavery has already been established for many, many decades. The king grants Carolina to 8 of his supporters, 8 loyal people, who are called the Lord Proprietors. So this is not necessarily a colony like Virginia, where you had a private company. This is the proprietors is a little more similar to, I guess, the patroonships of New Netherland, where you have a certain amount of individuals who have wield a significant amount of economic power, and they're going to be the dominant players in the political and social structure in the Carolinas. So they hope to use Carolina to supply their plantations in Barbados with food and to export other goods to Europe. So these very wealthy landowners who live in the West Indies in Barbados, what they find is that all the available land is given to sugar production. So Barbados and other West Indies islands, they can't feed themselves. They rely on trade with the rest of the mainland colonies to supply them with these provisions. So they're very much dependent on that. Pennsylvania, for instance, a thriving industry in Pennsylvania will be the production of wheat. Much of that wheat goes to the West Indies to supply those plantations with the food they need. And so you can see a map then of the Carolinas. So South Carolina will be settled first, followed by North Carolina, and then Georgia. Georgia will be the last colony established in the 13 colonies. Please note, though, that all of these colonies are constantly under threat by a colony to the south, and that is Spanish Florida. That's going to be significant. So one of the biggest port cities in South Carolina is Charlestown, named for, of course, Charles II of England. It is the busiest port in the South. It is a city with a very aristocratic feel, you could say well into the 19th century. And it is actually a city, though, that promotes religious toleration, and it will have the largest Jewish community in New York City. So this port city certainly is intended to export all of South Carolina's goods and establish trading links with other ports throughout colonial America, including the West Indies. Now, what is grown in Carolina? Well, Carolina, much like Virginia, has certain cash crops, the first of which is rice. Now, rice is typically grown in the South Carolina Low Country. The South Carolina Low Country would be the coastal regions of South Carolina. As you move further west, you get to what's called the Piedmont, and then you're into more mountainous regions as you go even further west. So South Carolina rice is grown pretty much in the Low Country. It's the primary export. It reaps a very good price. It was grown in Africa, and therefore they bring in slaves who are familiar with the production of rice. And the slaves that they bring in actually have a genetic trait that make them immune to malaria, which certainly helps with the mortality issue. And a significant thing about Carolina, you do not see this in Virginia. By 1710, black slaves are a majority in the Carolinas. In Virginia, it's going to take a lot longer for that to happen. And actually, I think it might never happen. But in the Carolinas, you have white settlers as the minority. Now, this is going to certainly lead to constant paranoia and constant fear of a slave revolt. And one such revolt will happen in the 1740s, and it's called the Stono Rebellion. So because of their location, very close to Spanish Florida, the planters of South Carolina are very afraid that slaves will run off to Spanish Florida to escape their freedom, and the Spanish will provide them a haven. They're also afraid that Indians will provide a haven for runaway slaves. And both of this is true. They do that. So there's this constant fear that slaves could potentially run away, or these slaves might gain power over the colony and potentially rebel. The Stono Rebellion, historians are a little unclear as to exactly what motivated it, how it starts, but it does result in the death of about 30 whites, which is, you don't see this in Virginia in the colonial era. You see this in South Carolina. And accordingly, obviously, the retribution is incredibly harsh, and I believe over 40 slaves are executed for their roles in this rebellion. The other crop that exists in South Carolina is indigo. Also reaps a very good price on the world market. Indigo is a dye, and it's simply used to color things blue. And today in the U.S., we still use it for blue jeans. So this crop can be grown not necessarily just on the low country, but as you move into the Piedmont and away from the coast, indigo will thrive in those regions as well. And you could see very quickly how much of these crops are produced and how much is exported into the world market. And this is going to make South Carolina an incredibly wealthy colony. And well up into the Revolution, South Carolina, much like New York, very reluctant at first to consider independence because they benefit a great deal off of trade with England. It's going to take a lot to convince them to give up that mercantile relationship. And then North Carolina. So how does North Carolina get its start? North Carolina is considered the sewer of the South. So North Carolina is pretty much a place for white trash, or people who dissent, people who are purged from their society. So Virginia was dominated by aristocratic planters who were generally Church of England members. People who do not want to belong to the Church of England, who do not want to pay taxes to the Church of England, might move south from Virginia to Northern Carolina. A lot of them are poor farmers. A lot of them cannot afford slaves. North Carolina, therefore, gets a reputation as being incredibly irreligious, immoral, hospitable to pirates, who obviously are seen as incredibly low class. They have a strong spirit of resistance to authority, and of course, like I mentioned, white trash. So in 1712, North Carolina will officially separate from South Carolina and become its own colony. Now, tobacco will be planted and will thrive in North Carolina eventually, but initially when it gets its start, it is a place for dissenters. And finally, to wrap up this lecture, Georgia. So you can see Georgia. Georgia is one of the last colonies settled. So in the 1730s, the only colony to come out of the 18th century. Georgia pretty much is created because England is looking for a way to reform their trash. So we saw in the 1600s that England, with its overpopulation, decided to send these people to the New World to try to get rid of them, to try to put them to work and make money for the empire. Georgia is created and named in honor of King George II, the monarch at the time. It's founded by James Oglethorpe, a wealthy man and a reformer, as a way to reform people who might be prisoners, who might be in debt, and they're trying to make these people economically viable. Interesting thing about Georgia is that they initially outlaw slavery. Now, if you think about why they would do that, the debates that will rage in Georgia in the 1750s. In the 1750s, Georgia will eventually allow the introduction of slaves. But initially, they did not want this to happen because slaves, of course, potentially deny poor whites of economic opportunity. Now, we saw something different in Virginia. We saw slavery was necessary to be introduced in order to prevent the class conflict that had plagued the rich whites and the poor laboring class. Georgia's philosophy, they're trying to create a colony of kind of small farmers, middling sort, middle class farmers that will be able to produce, agricultural goods for themselves or potentially for export. And they see slavery as a threat to that vision, which is very interesting. Now, Georgia, in terms of geopolitical reasons, Georgia, given the fact that it's the southernmost colony, is seen as a buffer zone between the valuable Carolinas with its rice and indigo exports, very wealthy colony, and Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. So Georgia will actually receive subsidies from the British government to offset the cost of defense. So Georgia is seen as a way to prevent the Spanish or the French from potentially attacking South Carolina. And like we already mentioned, it pretty much is a haven for debtors. It's a haven for the undesirable, who they're trying to put them, economically speaking, back on their feet and make them productive citizens. And slavery will be introduced in Georgia by 1750, and Georgia will increasingly turn to the production of cash crops. So with that, that is the end of the Restoration era. And as we continue in other lectures, we will begin to go into the 18th century and gravitate towards the American Revolution. So with that, good night and good luck.